Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by Armand Rosamilia, author of Dirty Deeds series. Armand, welcome to the show, and I'm assuming I butchered your last name.
You did, Paul, but that's all right. Most people do.
As I was joking before, I'm the Steve Harvey of podcasters, but I'm glad at least we got your first name and the series done correctly. So welcome to the show. Looking forward to this conversation. Are you ready to get started with our questions?
Let's go.
All right. Question number one. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
I have actually a real-world example that happened recently with me. I mentor a couple of other new authors that are coming up, and one of them, his first book is coming out. He's very excited. He's been writing it, and we have actually some book signings coming up in May, and he'll be part of it, and it'll be his very first book signing. So he's very excited, but the one thing I kept telling him over and over is stop writing and writing and writing. He kept going back and rewriting, and he had so many, at one point he had like 7 or 8 different drafts of this, that he was getting confused, and he was writing in different drafts and stuff, and he was second guessing himself on pretty much every line and every part. And I just finally just said to him, stop, give it to the editor, and let the editor butcher it, beat it up, do whatever, because you're just making it worse. And actually, what was cool is she took basically all of the versions, and she went through and she found like the best version that way and edited it that way. But don't overthink, especially on your first book. Just put it out there and just do it.
Yeah, there's always a couple of mantras that I teach my clients. One is done is better than perfect, and 2, don't be afraid to take the plunge. We can always fix it later.
Yeah, and I say to him, I say from experience, you don't want to hear this or not, but that first book is going to be your worst book, and that's all right. That's good, because it means you're progressing. It means you're getting better, book by book, story by story. That's what you want. And I look back and I don't want anybody to read that first book I ever did, and that's kind of the point is you get better at this as you go along.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I wrote my first book 4 years ago, and we just launched our 14th, and it was so funny. My editor, who has edited every one of my books, and she's like, wow, I was like, I can't believe how far you've come from your first book to your 14th. It's like you barely make mistakes. You're catching all these things. I don't even have to change up the tone or intonation or anything. It's like, you've really got this down. And I'm like, well, hey, I know this didn't happen on the first book, didn't happen on the 5th, but by the time you get to the 12th, 13th, and 14th books, you really start to get a hang of this, and you really start to evolve as you progress with this.
Yeah. Well, you need to find your voice as an author, especially if you're writing fiction. You need to figure out, basically as a kid, I read Dean Koontz. So everything I wrote in my teen years was this really bad Dean Koontz rip-off cliche stories. And once I got real world experience as I got older, and also I read a lot of different authors, which is very important, I found my voice, or I started to find my voice after those first, like you said, those first few books. It's your learning process.
Absolutely. I say it's an evolution. It just takes time. And the nice thing is, it's like riding a bike. First time you do it, second time, it does get easier and easier. And that's one thing I always tell my clients too, is like, it gets easier as you progress. It's just like anything else. It just takes time.
Yeah.
Well, what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
It's a lot easier. It's kind of a two-edged sword now. It's a lot easier to get published. There's so many different routes: self-publishing, working with a small press, having an agent who maybe gets you to the big 5 and all those things. I'm a hybrid. I work in all of those because I don't want to just put all my eggs in one basket. And I think the hardest part really is not the writing. It's not all that. It's the promotion. It's the getting out there. It's the what do you do now that my book is released? Because I've worked with a lot of presses that I knew if that first book didn't sell, there was never going to be a second book with them. And so that part of it really was the struggle, especially in the beginning for me. It wasn't the writing, it wasn't getting the book together and ready to go, because once you get to that point as a writer where you're confident enough in your skills that you can finish any story that you think of, and it's good enough, okay, I know I can finish this book or this short story, whatever. You get past that hurdle and you no longer have 57 unfinished things. But it's the maintaining this as a career, and that's, I think, really important. A lot of people just, I finished my first book, it's out there, and now I'm going to move on to the second book. Well, yeah, you need to write that second book, but you also need to try to sell that first one, or nobody's going to buy that second.
Well, and that's going to transition nice into our next question. That is, of course, about marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your previous book launches that has worked well.
Well, what I'm doing right here, Paul, podcast
Yep.
interviews. Um, it's you're selling more than the book. You're selling you as a person, as an author, and I think that's so important. On Twitter, there's tons and tons of people, all social media. There's tons of people who basically buy my book, and that's all you ever see from them. And they turn every conversation about them and into their books and stuff. And I think with me, the real important thing is I'd rather do this than do a guest post. Guest post might give you all the information about my book, but it's not going to give the personality. And sit here and talking with you, I might not even mention my book, but somebody's going to go away from here and go, nah, he seems interesting, hopefully, and let me see what he has out there. It's the same with doing book signings and stuff. I stand in front of the table. I talk to everybody going by, and I'm really introverted, but I turn on that persona. And I hardly ever talk about my books. We talk about what T-shirt he's wearing or different things, and that transitions a lot of times into selling books, or here's a bookmark and I'll see you at the next convention.
Exactly. There's 2 points with that. One, it's like a point of exposure. Everything that you do is a point of exposure. If it's a post, podcast interview, doing book sign-ins, speaking at events, they're all points of exposure. And the other counterpoint with that too is the fact that it's all about building relationships. That's what sales is at the end of the day. It's not a gimmick. It's not a pitch. It's not a script. It is building relationships with people, and this is exactly how you do it, with those different points of exposure through these interviews, through book signings, through being exhibitors at different events. I mean, that's how you do it.
Yeah, I did retail management for 20 years, so I saw all the tricks, and I learned all the tricks back and forth to. And it was always, for me, it was always about personality. It was always about people coming into my store or vendors or whatever. Don't hard sell me on anything. I don't care about your product. I believe in you,
Yep.
and I'm going to buy whatever from you. And that's the way you need to treat any of this.
Yeah, it really is. It comes down to your personal brand and to building those relationships. Well, what tips would you have for our listeners to get on podcasts?
There's so many really great ones out there. I'm gonna toot my own horn. I do I do Armcast podcast, which is over 5 years now. I've been doing it, and we're over 250 episodes. I love guests, and a lot of people go, "Oh, well, you just interview horror authors." No, in fact, I just interviewed a couple of different historical Western fiction authors. Basically, I just want interesting people. I just want people on the podcast that can sell themselves, not necessarily they're there to sell a book. I've had filmmakers, I've had musicians, I've had pro wrestlers, I've had a lot of different people. I just want people that I find interesting, and I kind of do it like you do. Just kind of let's just have a conversation, and that's the fun of it. So while there's a ton of really great podcasts out there, listen to the podcasts. Listen and get an idea of what's out there, because there's some that you might not enjoy. You know, when I found out I was going to be on this show, I went back and I listened to a couple from the beginning, a couple of the new ones, a couple in the middle. You just kind of sample and you go, okay, you know what, this is going to be a good podcast for me. You get an idea of what the host is looking for, and also I always try to get out of my comfort zone. I don't just say, all right, I'm just going to do horror podcasts or I'm just going to do crime thriller podcasts, because those are the two things I mostly write. You know, my thing is I'm just going to get out there and interview on as many different ones. It doesn't matter. I just want to be out there because there might be somebody in this listening audience that says, hey, this guy sounds interesting. Let me check out his books.
What are some tips and tricks that you would suggest to our listeners on how to get on podcasts? So, are they better off doing Google searches? What are some different methods that they could use to research these shows and to make sure it's a good fit? I mean, I know you could probably get iTunes and a few other things, but what are some things that you've actually utilized to really get that research going and to find that, okay, yeah, I want to be on this show. Let me send them an email.
You know, it's for me, it's always what podcast is used as a jump off. So I might listen to a podcast and somebody in their Twitter feed or their Facebook or whatever might mention another podcast. I'm also part of different groups. There's several public and private groups on Facebook, for instance, that has podcasts, and they'll talk about different, and they do like the different genres and the different things. It's real easy to Google, especially if you have, say, you're coming out and you have a fantasy book that's coming out. It's real easy to just Google fantasy podcasts.
Yeah.
Although you might get some weird ones in there. And start listening. Listen to a couple of them, and then get on. And as a podcaster, I'm always out there looking. I'm always listening to other podcasts. I'm always looking for guests, and I like to listen to people on other podcasts. So once you get out there and other podcasters know, hey, this person is available, this person has a personality and is a good interview, sometimes they start coming to you too, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to go a little bit off topic. So which pro wrestlers have you had on the show?
I had wow, what's his? So I've had Quackenbush.
Mike Quackenbush.
Mike Quackenbush. I've had him on several years ago, and then I've Ed. I can't think of his name. He was one of the writers for the during the infamous WWE they were getting
the guy that used to write with Vince Russo. I know who you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. I actually am friendly with him. I wouldn't say friends with him, but I had him on for. He doesn't do many interviews, but I convinced him to come on. And then on the network that I'm on, Project Entertainment Network, there's a show called The Curtain Jerkers, which is a pro wrestling show.
Yeah.
So
the
those guys, yeah, those guys are, send some of them my way as well, which is cool.
That's funny. I had to ask. So, a lot of people, they have the guilty pleasure. Mine's always been wrestling off and on. So you mentioned that you've had some wrestlers on the show. I was like, okay, I got to ask you about this.
I actually, years ago, about 10 years ago, I wrote a nonfiction wrestling book about local Florida Southern Championship Wrestling. Wow. And I got to interview Larry Zbyszko, and I got to interview Chris Tipton and Brian Kelly, who became Byron Sexton. I think he's still with the WWE, and a lot of the different people that came through, which was really, really neat, really interesting.
Yeah, because that turned into FCW, turned into NXT. It's just funny how that all evolved in the Florida scene.
Yeah, and I grew up in New Jersey, so I got to see, I get to go to Madison Square Garden. I got to go to the Meadowlands. I got to go to a lot of little indie shows. So I'm almost 50, and I've been a wrestling fan on and off since I was about 10. So there was a lot of wrestling growing up in my house.
Oh yeah, we had WrestleMania here 3 years ago, and me and my teacher pals went. In fact, always in the back of the book, I always acknowledge them because we call ourselves the Four Horsemen, and it's me and two of my teacher pals. We just go back a long time. Our other friend, and every time we get together, we're flashing the four, and it's just a nice release. Some people like The Bachelorette, some people like UFC, but our thing was always just the wrestling, just because it was fun and it was an escape, and we just had a really good time. And that WrestleMania weekend was a ton of fun. In fact, I'm actually going to the New Japan pro wrestling event in June that we're gonna have here at the American Airlines Center in Dallas. Got really good tickets for it. So
Oh wow. Oh, that's cool.
it's always fun seeing that stuff. So out of 286 episodes, this is the first time we've talked about wrestling. So this is actually kind of fun. It's a good little mix. So I'm glad we were able to take a little deeper dive into that. Well, let's talk about your favorite book. So what is your favorite book, and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
When I was very young, this is before I got into really, I got into reading as a kid. You read what they gave you in school,
Yeah.
and my mother was still is a huge reader, but I was like, I'm not interested. I'm 10 years old and I'm going to go outside and play kickball and manhunt, and me and my brother are going to wrestle in the living room. And he was always Ric Flair, and I was always one of the Road Warriors. And at about 10 or 11 years old, my mother bought me Watership Down by Richard Adams. And I think she bought it because she saw, oh, it's got bunnies on the cover, and this is probably, it's a fantasy thing, it's fun. And I read that, and I was completely blown away. I remember as a kid, it was like one of those cliche moments, but it was truth, where I read this, and it blew my mind that it was an adult story, really, with bunny rabbits, and they were killing each other, and they were fighting, and there was wars, and there was all this stuff, and then there was all this emotion and suffering, and the plight of these little bunnies, and it just really blew me away. And I remember from that moment on just really getting into reading. And then my mother used to she was a huge Stephen King and Dean Koontz fan. I started reading all of her Dean Koontz books, and that's when I really got into the horror and different things. And it was amazing as a kid because you're forced to read all this stuff, these kind of little kid books growing up, and they were all boring for me. So to be able to read Watership Down, I think that was kind of that moment where I was like, the sky's the limit. You can do anything you want in a book.
Absolutely. It really is amazing. It just starts off with a blank canvas and you can paint an entire world.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and I still get that sometimes. I still read, and I still get that moment, and I say, I'm impressed by the thoughts and the imagination and the way somebody can put a story together. When I watch television or a movie, you turn your brain off, and most of the time I'm watching, I'm like, I know what's going to happen next.
Mm-hmm.
And but with books, especially a lot of independent books that I read, authors, I'm blown away by the creativity.
Absolutely. Well, for our final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
So there's a Michael Jordan quote that I used to have up on my wall, and actually I would refer to it or look at it when I was, and it was I failed over and over again in my life, and that's why I succeed. And it's such a simple thing, and and I'm not even a basketball fan, but it was just one of those things that I had heard, and I wrote it down. I jotted it down on a piece of paper, and I put it up on the wall, and I had it there for many years actually. And it was really, for me, especially, I had it when I was working retail. I was working full time, 80 hours a week. I was married with young kids at the time, and I had no time. I felt like I had no time for me, for writing. And then when I was writing, I wasn't selling anything. It was going nowhere, and I was really getting kind of down on myself. And it's one of those quotes that you look and you go, Michael Jordan didn't just step out on a basketball court and just, start scoring and winning titles like crazy. He had to fail so many times, and it made him appreciate that more. And I think where I am now in my career, I appreciate it a lot more because I feel like I've earned every step of this. And I've done, if there's anything you can do wrong, I've done it wrong in the past. I've screwed up so many times and learned the hard way on a lot of this. But in the end, I'm really, really comfortable in my skin now. I'm really happy with where I am.
Well, Armand, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
They can go to armandrosamilia.com, or I'm Armand Author on Twitter, And you can find my podcast on projectentertainmentnetwork.com.
Armand, thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Thanks, Paul. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how you can be featured in our brand new Get Published business book, go to getpublishedpodcast.com.